The CCP virus started in China, but to solve it, the US needs to cooperate with China. At least, that's what they want you to believe. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The coronavirus, or the Chinese Communist Party virus, continues to spread across China and around the world. But you know who's doing a great job handling it? The Chinese Communist Party. Now sure, their terrifying authoritarian crackdown on Chinese citizens has not actually stopped the spread of the virus, which is weird, because you'd think beating people up and shoving them into boxes would be the perfect solution. But what the Chinese Communist Party is good at is changing the narrative. Over the past 3 months, the party's narrative has shifted constantly, from a cover-up to a battle to blaming other countries, even claiming that the US Army started the coronavirus epidemic. And now that the coronavirus outbreak is really bad in the US, the Chinese Communist Party is spinning a new narrative. The US and China must cooperate. What does cooperation mean? Well, this open letter signed by 100 Chinese scholars says that countries should be working together, not complaining, finger-pointing, and blaming one another. Yes, countries should not say, for example, that the coronavirus started in
China.
Because really, cooperation is more important than truth. But it's not just Chinese scholars calling for cooperation. This open letter signed by 90 prominent Americans says, "We, the undersigned, believe that the logic for cooperation is compelling." The undersigned include Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State for Bill Clinton, Stephen Hadley, the National Security Advisor under George W. Bush, and Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor under Obama. They write, "No effort against the coronavirus will be successful without some degree of cooperation between the United States and China." Now sure, cooperation sounds good. After all, since we were kids, we've been told to share and cooperate and work together, which I told Mrs. Enfield was a bunch of commie garbage, and I am a free American. She put me in a timeout. Filthy commie. But the idea of the US-China cooperation that China is presenting is not actually about unselfish teamwork. US-China cooperation is the party line, straight from the Chinese regime. We know this because it's been pushed by Chinese state-run media. Fighting COVID-19 requires international cooperation, and Xi Jinping and his unremitting call for global health cooperation, and China calls for G20 cooperation. The Communist Party's call for cooperation has political reasons behind it, and that starts to become clear if you read this op-ed in the New York Times written by China's ambassador to the US, titled, "China and the US Must Cooperate Against Coronavirus." The Chinese ambassador writes that at a time when solidarity is essential, we need to keep cool heads and clearly say no to the folly of fanning racism and xenophobia and to scapegoating other countries or races. So now that we all agree we have to cooperate, that means don't blame the Chinese Communist Party for a so-called cover-up. That would be racism and xenophobia. But the Chinese ambassador's message went further. See, we need more than just the spirit of not blaming each other. To fight this deadly virus, we must also explore the sharing of pharmaceutical technologies among nations and keep the global industrial and supply chains open. Those two things he's saying we need to keep doing, those are precisely the things the Chinese Communist Party is afraid of losing. First, over the last couple decades, American drug makers have gradually outsourced their manufacturing and technology to China. Today, the vast majority of generic drugs Americans use are made in Chinese factories. But now, US officials are worried about Chinese control of America's drug supply. Rosemary Gibson, author of China RX, said this means the Chinese regime could potentially weaponize our medicines, and that the US should resume making drug ingredients at home. And even the White House is talking about this now. So from the Communist Party's perspective, of course we should explore the sharing of pharmaceutical technologies among nations. Second, the ambassador's comment about keeping the global industrial and supply chains open. That doesn't come from nowhere either. The pandemic is already accelerating America's push to move manufacturing and supply chains out of China. And it's not just America. Other countries are talking about moving supply chains out of China too, like Canada and Europe. Europe's a country. You see, without foreign direct investment, China's economy will be in big trouble. So when the Chinese regime calls for cooperation, it's not in the spirit of teamwork and fighting the virus. Remember, just a few weeks ago, they were trying to blame the US military. China's cooperation means cooperation on their terms. It's a tactic to avoid blame from the rest of the world, especially the US. Chinese diplomat Chen Yongling, who's now a defector living in Australia, explained this tactic in a recent phone interview with NTD.
Before, when I worked for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, we called it two-handed or dual tactics. We always used two-handed tactics to deal with the US. Deng Xiaoping said you need to hide your strength, bide your time. You need to struggle with the enemy, but also cooperate. It's a contradiction. But you need to take advantage of this contradiction and constantly adjust your strategy. Sometimes cooperate more, sometimes fight more. Don't fight out in the open, fight in secret.
So the Chinese regime is now fighting in secret, while at the same time calling for cooperation. Like how it had its state-run media accuse the US of being racist and blaming the US military for starting the coronavirus. But at the same time, it's saying we should not point fingers. Instead, China and the US need to cooperate. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't mean they want to cooperate with the US. They mean they want the US to cooperate with them on their terms, which means they keep lying and cheating and the US keeps giving them technology and money. This is called win-win mutual cooperation with Chinese characteristics. By the way, earlier I mentioned that there were US scholars and diplomats who were also urging the US to cooperate with China. Now, I'm not saying that all of these people are doing it to follow the party's line, but the party has used this cooperation rhetoric so much over the years that it's become conventional wisdom. It reminds me of another piece of conventional wisdom about China that people believed for years, that if we just open up China's economy and give them lots of money, they'll naturally become more free and democratic. We all saw how that one turned out. And next, I'll answer a question from a fan who supports China Uncensored on Patreon. Joe Rui asks, when the world wises up about the nature of the CCP after this pandemic, what leverage will the world have to apply pressure to the CCP to pursue changes within China or reparations? Good question, Joe. The US has more leverage than a lot of people think. The Chinese Communist Party would have faced dire economic consequences years ago if it weren't for the US's massive foreign direct investment in China, which has totaled more than $1 trillion in the past 2 decades. Now, there's increasing public support for pulling supply chains out of China. The majority of Americans even support reparations from China to pay for the coronavirus fallout. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party will never pay reparations. But the US government could retaliate by requiring companies to leave China. Last August, President Trump actually told companies they ought to leave China. It was more of a suggestion, but American media made fun of Trump for it. But no one would be laughing if he said that again today. Of course, whether Trump can actually require companies to leave China is debatable. If he tried, it would probably have to be settled by the US courts. But the US government can incentivize US companies to not manufacture in China, like with tariffs. Moving manufacturing out of China would give the US enormous leverage to deal with the CCP. Thanks for your question, Joe. And thank you for watching. Be like Joe and contribute to China Uncensored through the crowdfunding website Patreon. We rely on your support to keep making great episodes like this, especially during the CCP virus outbreak. Go to patreon.com/China Uncensored to learn more. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.